I'll give a real life example of how, in fact, over time things developed and changed, and then in the next generation they established it as if it had always been that way. The example for this is actually the text of the Bible. The wording and the grammar of the letters and words is what we know now as the text of the Bible. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the same text that the sages had, or the same text that the rabbis in the Middle Ages had, or what happened during the Second Temple period and what happened in the First Temple period, or since Moses wrote the Torah. So researchers come and claim that in fact this whole consolidation of the Holy Scriptures was a process that took hundreds of years. That is, at first it wasn't even written down at all, but rather people spoke and told stories orally. Then various communities and political or religious agendas came and wrote the stories in their own style. Later, after several hundred years, they came and collected all the collections that existed in different places. That's also why there are contradictions, duplications, and inaccuracies. And at that stage, in that period, there was also no problem with changing what was written. If a word didn't seem right to you, didn't fit the meaning or the context, they changed it, and that was acceptable. Only in the 1st century CE did a canon of the Holy Scriptures begin to take shape, one that could no longer be changed. And that's it, it's stuck. And then people come later and say, no, it was like this before you. It was always the canon. No, it was. And this is the example I want to give so you can understand how things become ingrained among the people as if they have always been that way, when in fact it's a process. There were changes, and gradually somehow a certain opinion or belief took shape. And the example I want to bring forward here to illustrate just how naive people of faith can be is just the matter of the text of the Bible. The addition to the Bible, mainly regarding the Ahavi letters, the vowel letters, which are Aleph, He, Vav, Vav, which are actually letters that tell you how to read it. If you want to read it with a Hirik, you add a Yud. If you want to read it with a Holam, you add a Vav. And in the Torah, many times this is missing, even the same word. Sometimes it's written Yimlok, with a Vav between the Lamed and the Kaf. Sometimes it's written with or without a Vav. Totafot, with or without a Vav. Mezuzot, with or without a Vav. And Sukkah, with or without a Vav. And then, at that time, there was a period when people were not experts. They weren't experts in knowing when to include the extra letters and when not to. In the time of the Talmud, there's an explicit statement that they were not proficient in the missing and extra letters in Tractate Kiddushin, page Lamed. They were not proficient in the missing and extra letters. So what happened? From the 15th century, when a certain type of tradition had already formed, up until the 15th century, there were different books with different versions of the text. Then they decided to establish an order. The rabbis came and decided to establish an order, mainly Minchat Shai. He set a certain order and said that he determined the text based mostly on the majority and on common sense. Not that this is the exact text, but you have no choice. I'm just a person. I'll do my best to get as close as possible to the standard version. And he took the books and gathered them, looked at the versions, saw where most of the books had a certain version, and indeed this matched the common sense of the Minchat Shai, so he established the text. And that's how the Koren text was established, the text of Koren publishing. And this is the version that is used in most synagogues, and now they consider it as the standard. And that's actually the change today. They come from among the believers and think that this Koren version, which was only established in the 15th century, has always existed since the creation of the world. To such an extent, as the rabbi says. And the Zohar comes and says that it's clear you can't say that a Torah scroll missing even one letter is valid, for that would be an affront to his blessed name. To that extent, the Kabbalists come and make their claim. So, I want to give you an example of a distortion in the Bible, and this will also teach you that this is a human process. There are changes and there are mistakes, and in the end, a certain version is consolidated, and then, after the version is established, people come and lie, claiming that no, this version has always existed. is the same with Revelation and the same with the commandments. Everything is like this. So I'll give you two examples. In the Torah portion of Toldot, it is written that Rebecca became pregnant. And then she went to inquire of the Lord, and he said to her, 2 nations are in your womb. Now, the word 2 nations in your womb is not written with a vav, Goyim, nations, as in proud nations with a vav and a yud, but with 2 yuds, Gaim. They just read it as Goyim. I'll try to show you this so that anyone who doesn't have a Tanakh at home can see it. You see, it's written with just 2 yuds, but it's read as Goyim, nations. That means that the version of the Bible by Koren, which the Mincha Tzionit established, has it with 2 yuds. But what? In the Talmud, in Tractate Berachot, page 57a, it appears that in the time of the sages it was written Goyim with a vav, not with 2 yuds. Because they say in Tractate Berachot, on page 57b, they say, and the Lord said to her, 2 nations, Goyim, are in your womb. Do not read it as Goyim, nations, but as Gaim, proud ones. And from this they derive a teaching about who these proud ones are from the language of... If there were proud ones in their lives, it was Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi and Antoninus, who were both wealthy and powerful. So this means that there is a difference between the Torah scroll from the time of the sages and the Torah scroll of our time. Here is an example that the Torah scroll is a process of consolidation until you finalize and establish the text, and that's it. Now it's easy to consolidate a text because we have printing, and printing makes fewer mistakes. It's not like the text of the Bible is copied by hand. Since the witnesses are so numerous, I'll give a second example. The second example is also in Parashat Toldot, in chapter 27, verse 1, where it says that Isaac was old and had begun to see less well, and his eyes had grown dim. Thank you. And then he comes to Esau and says to him, listen, any day now I could die at any moment. So take your gear and go out to the field and hunt me some game. That's what we call game, but it's written as Tzeidah with a hey at the end. I'll show you again. For those who don't have a Tanakh, you see the word Tzeidah, but it's actually read as Tzayid. That is, the word Tzayid has an extra hey at the end. Now, the fact that it's written with an extra hey implies that it wasn't like this until the 12th century. Because the sages don't address Tzeidah, they don't interpret the hey, they don't do anything with it. Only Lekach Tov comes and explains, writes that it's written with a hey, and he even, outside of his commentary, I'm saying outside of his commentary, he interprets why? Why? Why is it written with a hey but pronounced Tzayid as if there's no hey? Because this hey represents the 5 laws of Shechita, ritual slaughter. Now why is that? Why is this an exception? Because all the laws of Shechita, in practice, the sages established them, and from the Torah itself there is no law of Shechita. And the proof is that he says, Tzayid, how do you hunt? You don't slaughter, you hunt with a bow and arrow. He says to him, take your gear, your quiver, and your bow. Meaning, how did they want to do it? He killed it with a bow and arrow, the deer or the gazelle, and that's it. So look, here comes a verse that implies there is no Shechita. If we go by the Yalkut Tov, which is only from the 12th century, he comes and interprets that here Yitzchak hinted to Esav about the laws of Shechita, and that's why he adds him. Now, so you don't think that I'm the only one claiming there's a difference between the text of the Chazal and the text of the Torah and the version we have, I'll read to you what the Meiri claims. The Meiri is Rabbi Menachem ben Shlomo, who lived in the 13th century and was one of the rabbis of the Middle Ages. He studied philosophy, was interested in the sciences, so he was more rational. And he supported the debate about whether to accept Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed or not to accept it. And he came and supported that it should indeed be accepted, as it contains words of analysis, wisdom, and understanding. Now, I always say that the era of the rabbis in the Middle Ages who studied philosophy, they restored the culture and creativity of the Jewish people, brought it back to the right path. in contrast to the sages who degraded the Bible and the Tanakh to a cheap drink and to a shameful cultural creation. Simply shameful, as I demonstrate in all the videos. So my fellow townsman, Rabbi Menachem ben Shlomo, who studied a bit of philosophy, was a realistic person and didn't make up sermons, nonsense, or endless ramblings. So he writes the following about this version. He says, in the book Kiryat Sefer, which is the work of the Meiri, in the second essay he writes, and now we need to clarify the matter of missing and extra letters, meaning words that may or may not have the vowelization of ahavi or lack the vowelization of ahavi. So we need to clarify the matter of missing and extra letters. How do we decide, how do we rule and determine when we find that there is a disagreement between the teachings of our sages, peace be upon them, that is, between the sages of the Talmud and the ancient traditions, which were compiled by the scholars of language and the precise books. The Meiri in the Middle Ages comes and says there is a difference between the text of the Talmud, according to the sages and their midrashim, versus our own text, which was produced by scholars who were already grammarians and knew grammar, not like the sages of the Talmud, who did not know grammar. And so in the midrashim of our sages, we find, and he gives an example of a change. It is written, we find that the sages interpreted it as, and to the sons of the concubines, which is without a yud, meaning between the shin and the mem there is no yud. But in our Masoretic texts there is a yud, and that's what happens with us as well. There is a yud. Then he gives another example. On the day Moses finished, the word finished, kalot, is written with a vav, but in the midrash, according to the sages, it is kalot, kalat, kalot, without a vav, missing a vav. So what do? The Meiri asks, how do we make a decision? What should be the rule? Should we follow the sages or the precise books that know the grammar of the language? And then he states the rule that should determine which version we should follow. And I consulted with the great leaders of the generation on this matter. He says that he saw that other great sages come and instruct as follows: that everything that appears in the Talmud or in the Midrash, if something is derived from it, if they interpret from that word something from which a legal ruling emerges, then we rely on the sages and not on the precisely edited books from his time in the Middle Ages. But if it is an interpretation like with the concubines, where no legal ruling comes from it, but rather it is just a story, an Aggadic teaching derived from it, then we follow the precisely edited books. So in practice, the Meiri's rule comes and says that one must make a decision. If there is a contradiction between the version of the sages and the version found in the books from his time in the Middle Ages, he creates a kind of hybrid, and in effect he produces a new Torah scroll. Because it is not according to the precisely edited books. If it concerns halakhic rulings, he follows the sages. If it concerns Aggadic matters, he follows the precisely edited books, and thus he essentially created a third book. Which, according to his opinion, is how one should decide when there is a change in the tradition. Now, besides the fact that I have just demonstrated this, and for anyone interested in this and who finds the text of the Bible fascinating, on the .emet website there is a section called Text of the Bible, where you can find a comparison between the Babylonian Torah scroll and the Tiberian Torah scroll. There is a difference between them. The Septuagint, which was composed by the Greeks and translated into Greek, compared to our version of the Torah, there is also an article I wrote where I compared 3 Tanakh books that are currently in circulation among us: the Leningrad Codex, the Koren edition, and the Brewer edition, and there are also differences between them as well currently. So for anyone interested, the .emet website, the biblical text section, has, in my opinion, fascinating articles. So besides the fact that I just showed how a text version is formed. Now what happens next? After a version was established in the 15th century by the scribe who was, and he comes and writes, he writes in the introduction how he determined what he determined. And then also the printing press was invented during that period. And then they started printing the Bible according to the version of the scribe. And so this version became fixed. So today in our time, there is no longer a question of the text version. In the Middle Ages, there was a question of the text version because there were books. Everyone wrote by hand, and they saw that in this synagogue it was written one way, in that synagogue it was written differently, and in another it was written differently again. There was uncertainty, as Meiri says, about how to decide. So they established rules, reasonable and logical rules. But these reasonable and logical rules are only hypotheses, and in the end, they created a new Torah scroll with a new version in order to decide between the various different books. And today, yeshiva students don't know this. They don't learn it in yeshiva. When the text changes, it evolves as people do, and there are mistakes, and then you need to consult rabbis. Afterwards, they don't do this, they don't know this at all. What do they imagine? They imagine that today's version is how it always was, that this is the real authentic text now. Moreover, they educate in such a way that this is the true version, and they don't tell the stories that in reality it's a process of evolution. And to show that it's a process, the Meiri himself writes that since in practice we make a human decision and we don't really know the exact text, he says, I tend to be lenient if a Torah scroll is missing a vav or has an extra one in the word, with the letters Aleph, Hey, Bet, Yud, because in the word we don't know, and there's no need to check a Torah scroll. So it's clear that in the Middle Ages the text had not yet been finalized. The text only became fixed after the invention of the printing press and after the public accepted the opinion of the Minchat Shai. That's why today yeshiva students come and imagine that there has always been an exact text, that there are no errors here. And because of this belief, all kinds of people, especially newly religious who are a bit familiar with software and letter skipping, come up with inventions. Just invent things. What did they invent? That since this is the Torah of God and the Torah of God has not changed and this is an exact text, then you can do letter skipping and find secrets and hidden messages in the Torah. They started running software until they found hidden messages through letter skipping and all sorts of nonsense like that. Now, I'm not even getting into their statistics because in any book, if you take a letter skipping program and want to find skips, you just try run skips of this and that kind until you find something, and then you say, oh look, I found hidden messages. You can do this trick with any book, and I even did it with War and Peace and found better hidden messages, better than what the letter skipping people find. So aside from this lie that they simply force themselves to find hidden messages, the text itself is not accurate. It's not the original text. So what hidden messages are we even talking about? After all, when God hid secrets, he hid them according to his own original text. And that, in any case, has already been corrupted. It was corrupted in many chapters, in large quantities, because even in the Talmud, they were not experts in the presence or absence of certain letters. They weren't, and as long as the text changes, it changes the skipping. So here you have yet another lie. A lie from rabbis who simply deceive the yeshiva students or the young people who come. And I say this because many come to me and ask, how do you explain the skips, the hidden codes? It's nonsense, it's a lie, it's a fraud. It's a fraud because this version is a compiled text that definitely was not the original version, because as I already said, it's a combination of several books that essentially created a new version. And that's why I also say that religion stands on three things. It stands on lies, on fear, and on equipment. And this is one of their lies. They are always lying, it's always been this way, and then they come up with excuses afterward.